A New York judge just issued a decision that could reshape the financial future of a former president. Donald Trump faced a March 25th deadline to secure a bond worth nearly $500 million, and what happened next has sent shockwaves through legal and political circles across America. This isn't speculation or rumor. This is documented court proceedings with real consequences that are unfolding right now. Let's be clear about what we're discussing. In February 2024, New York Judge Arthur Engoron issued a final judgment in the civil fraud case brought by New York Attorney General Letitia James against Donald Trump, his sons, and the Trump Organization. The judgment ordered Trump to pay $354 million in penalties, plus interest that has been accruing daily. By the time enforcement began, the total had grown to approximately $454 million. This represents one of the largest civil fraud penalties in New York State history. The case itself centered on allegations that Trump and his organization systematically inflated the value of assets on financial statements provided to banks and insurers. The Attorney General's office presented evidence covering transactions from 2011 through 2021, arguing that properties like Trump Tower, 40 Wall Street, and various golf courses were valued far above legitimate appraisals. Judge Engoron's decision found that Trump had engaged in persistent fraud, leading to the massive penalty and additional restrictions on doing business in New York. Here's where the bond requirement becomes critical. Under New York law, when someone appeals a civil judgment, they typically must post a bond for the full amount plus interest to prevent the winning party from collecting while the appeal is pending. This protects both sides. The appellant gets their day in court on appeal, but the judgment holder has security if the appeal fails. For Trump, this meant securing a bond worth over $450 million within 30 days of the judgment. Trump's legal team immediately signaled this would be extraordinarily difficult. They approached approximately 30 different surety companies, firms that issue bonds for large judgments. According to court filings submitted by Trump's attorneys, every company either declined or said they couldn't provide a bond of this size for real estate assets. Surety companies typically want liquid assets or securities as collateral, not properties that would need to be appraised and potentially sold. As the March 25th deadline approached, Trump's lawyers filed an emergency motion with a New York appeals court. They argued that posting the full bond was a practical impossibility and requested that the requirement be reduced or that Trump be allowed to post a smaller bond while appealing. The filing included a declaration from an insurance broker stating that obtaining such a large bond secured by real estate was unprecedented in his experience. The legal arguments centered on several points. Trump's team contended that forcing the sale of properties to raise cash for the bond would cause irreparable harm. They also argued that the bond requirement was excessive under New York law, which allows courts to consider whether a bond requirement might be unconstitutionally punitive. The Attorney General's office opposed any reduction, arguing that Trump had the resources and that allowing a smaller bond would undermine the judgment's purpose. On March 25th, a New York appeals court panel issued its decision. The court reduced the bond requirement to $175 million and gave Trump an additional 10 days to secure it. This was a significant victory for Trump's legal strategy. The appeals court found that requiring the full amount could indeed cause unnecessary hardship while the appeal was being considered. However, they still required a substantial bond to ensure the state's interests were protected. Trump's team moved quickly. Within the extended deadline, they secured a $175 million bond through Knight Specialty Insurance Company. The bond was guaranteed by the company, though the specific collateral arrangement remained private, as is typical in such agreements. This meant Trump could proceed with his appeal without facing immediate asset seizures or property sales. But this ruling raises questions that go far beyond one person's financial situation. What happens next in the appeals process? How does this decision affect other high-profile civil cases? And what does it mean when someone facing a near $500 million judgment can negotiate the terms before even beginning their appeal? The answers reveal critical insights about how our legal system handles cases involving the wealthy and powerful. The appellate court's decision to reduce Trump's bond requirement from $454 million to $175 million represents a legally significant ruling with implications that extend throughout the American judicial system. Let's examine what this means for the case itself and for civil litigation more broadly. First, the substance of the appeal. Trump's legal team is arguing that Judge Engoron's original ruling was flawed on multiple grounds. They contend there was no actual fraud because the banks and insurers who received the allegedly inflated financial statements conducted their own due diligence, suffered no losses, and in fact profited from the transactions. They are also challenging the legal theory that allowed the Attorney General to bring the case without needing to prove that any victim was harmed. Additionally, they argue the penalty amount is grossly disproportionate to any alleged wrongdoing. The appeals process in New York's appellate division will likely take between 6 months to over a year. A panel of appellate judges will review the trial record, written briefs from both sides, and hear oral arguments. They have several options. They could affirm the judgment entirely, reverse it completely, modify the penalty amount, or order a new trial on certain issues. Each outcome would have distinct consequences. If the appellate court affirms the judgment, Trump would owe the full $454 million plus continuing interest. The $175 million bond would be applied to that amount, but he would need to pay the remainder. If he couldn't, the Attorney General could move to seize and sell assets to satisfy the judgment. If the court reverses or significantly reduces the penalty, Trump would get back his bond money minus whatever reduced amount was determined. The broader legal implications deserve attention. New York's Executive Law Section 63(12), which Attorney General James used to bring this case, gives the Attorney General broad authority to address repeated fraud in business dealings. This statute doesn't require proving that any particular victim was harmed, only that fraudulent practices occurred. Trump's appeal challenges whether this statute can be used to impose massive penalties when sophisticated financial institutions did their own assessments and weren't deceived. If Trump's appeal succeeds on this point, it could limit how New York's Attorney General uses this law in future business fraud cases. Conversely, if the judgment is upheld, it would affirm that inflating asset values on financial statements constitutes fraud regardless of whether lenders were ultimately harmed. This matters for how business valuations and financial disclosures are treated under New York law going forward. The bond reduction itself also sets precedent. The appellate court found that requiring a bond equal to the full judgment plus interest could work an irreparable hardship, especially for judgments secured by real estate. This reasoning could apply in other large civil cases, not just those involving Trump. However, the court still required a substantial bond, $175 million, which is far beyond what most defendants could secure. This highlights a fundamental tension in our legal system regarding how wealth affects access to the appeals process. There are also political dimensions that cannot be ignored while remaining factually grounded. Attorney General Letitia James campaigned partially on investigating Trump, which his supporters cite as evidence of political motivation. Her office counters that the evidence of fraud was substantial and that no one is above the law regardless of political position. These competing narratives will continue as the case proceeds, but the legal merits will ultimately be decided by appellate judges based on the trial record and applicable law. Looking ahead, several scenarios could unfold. The appeal could take well into 2025 or beyond, meaning final resolution remains distant. During this time, Trump continues business operations under certain restrictions imposed by Judge Engoron, including having an independent monitor oversee financial reporting. If Trump were to win the 2024 presidential election while the case is pending, it would create an unprecedented situation of a sitting president appealing a massive civil fraud judgment, though this wouldn't directly affect the New York State court proceedings. For American democracy and governance, this case raises important questions about accountability, the rule of law, and equal justice. Supporters of the prosecution argue it demonstrates that powerful individuals face consequences for alleged fraud. Critics contend it represents politicized use of prosecutorial power. Both perspectives will shape public discourse as the legal process continues. The ultimate takeaway is that our judicial system is working through these questions using established legal procedures. The trial happened, a judgment was issued, bond requirements were negotiated through proper legal channels, and now the appellate process will unfold. This is how civil litigation functions in America, even in high-profile cases with political overtones. For those following this case, the next key dates will be the filing of appellate briefs and eventual oral arguments before the appellate division. Those proceedings will be public and will reveal the specific legal arguments both sides are advancing. Legitimate legal analysts and news organizations will cover those developments as they occur. If you found this analysis helpful, subscribe to Justice Watch USA for fact-based coverage of major legal and political developments. We focus on documented court proceedings, verified information, and professional legal analysis without sensationalism. Share this video with anyone interested in understanding how our legal system actually works in complex, high-profile cases. And check the description for links to court documents and credible news sources where you can verify the information we've discussed today.